The dinner table was set with precision, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on the polished wooden surface. The sound of silverware against porcelain filled the air, punctuated by occasional laughter and murmured conversations. Everything about the evening was perfectly ordinary, yet I could feel the undercurrent of something new, something unspoken. He had arrived earlier that day. My husband's nephew. The boy I had seen grow into a man over the years, though I had never paid much attention to him before. But tonight, as he sat across from me, his presence felt different. More defined. There was a confidence in the way he carried himself, a quiet ease that contrasted with my husband's composed and predictable demeanor. I had always been grateful for my marriage. It was steady, built on mutual respect and understanding. There was no grand passion, but there was loyalty. My husband was a good man, attentive in practical ways, devoted to the life we had built together. But something had been missing for a long time, something I had trained myself to ignore. The touch of longing. The feeling of being wanted not just as a partner but as a woman. I was pouring wine when I felt it, the first flicker of awareness. A gaze lingering on me a second too long. I looked up, meeting his eyes across the table. There was nothing obvious in his expression, nothing that would cause suspicion. But something inside me shifted. I lowered my gaze quickly, willing myself to dismiss it. I was imagining things. The conversation moved from business to travel, to casual family anecdotes. I listened, spoke when necessary, smiled at the right moments. But I was acutely aware of him. The way his fingers toyed with the rim of his glass. The casual tilt of his head when he laughed. The way his shirt stretched across broad shoulders that hadn't been there years ago. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus on my husband's words. Later that evening, after my husband had gone to bed, I stayed in the kitchen, rinsing dishes, listening to the quiet hum of the night outside. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. I told myself I was simply enjoying the peace. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn immediately, keeping my hands occupied with the dishes. But I knew it was him before he even spoke. "You always stay up this late?" His voice was smooth, lacking the awkwardness I remembered from years ago. "Sometimes," I answered, keeping my tone neutral. He stepped closer, just enough that I could sense him without looking. "You seemed lost in thought at dinner." I turned off the faucet, wiping my hands slowly before facing him. "Just tired, I guess." He didn't look away. There was something direct in his gaze, something that made my breath hitch. The moment stretched between us, neither of us moving, neither of us breaking eye contact. Then, as if realizing the weight of the silence, he gave a small, knowing smile. "Good night." And just like that, he walked away. I stood there long after he was gone, gripping the counter as if it could ground me. My heart was beating too fast, my skin warm despite the cool air. This was ridiculous. I was being ridiculous. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. His gaze, steady and unreadable. His voice wrapping around me like something tangible. I turned onto my side, squeezing my eyes shut, willing myself to think of my husband. But even as I tried to block it out, a strange thought whispered through me. I wanted to see him again. The next morning, everything returned to normal. My husband left early for work, kissing my cheek in a habitual gesture that neither of us thought about anymore. I went through my morning routine, convincing myself that the previous night had been nothing. A moment of foolishness, an overactive imagination. But when I stepped into the living room, I saw him sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I entered, and the air between us thickened instantly. I hesitated. "Morning," I said finally, my voice lighter than I intended. He stretched, his shirt lifting slightly as he moved. "Morning." I told myself to walk away, to ignore whatever this was before it had a chance to take root. But instead I found myself pausing, my fingers tightening around the edge of the kitchen counter. "Coffee?" I asked, my voice betraying none of the chaos inside me. His lips curled into a small smile, unreadable but deliberate. "Sure." And just like that, an invisible line had been drawn. I just wasn't sure which side of it I wanted to stand on. I spent the entire morning convincing myself that I had imagined it. That his gaze had held no deeper meaning. That my reaction was nothing more than an overactive mind grasping at something that didn't exist. It was foolish, really. But no matter how many times I told myself that, my body betrayed me. The sharp awareness, the way my skin tingled whenever he entered the room, it was undeniable. The house was quieter that day, with my husband at work and the morning hours stretching endlessly before me. I found small tasks to keep myself busy, hoping that distractions would help. Folding laundry, answering emails, watering the plants. But none of it worked. I was too aware of his presence in the house, moving through the same rooms, breathing the same air. It didn't help that he was so at ease. Unlike me, he seemed unaffected. Or at least he didn't show it. I caught glimpses of him lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone, stretching his arms behind his head as if he had all the time in the world. His presence was effortless, unforced. Made me feel unsteady, restless. The afternoon sun had begun to warm the house when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned from the kitchen counter, finding him leaning against the doorway watching me. "Need help with anything?" I hesitated for a moment before shaking my head. "No, I'm fine." His gaze flickered to the half-cut vegetables in front of me. "You sure?" "I'm good with a knife." I should have told him no. Should have sent him away before whatever this was had the chance to take shape. But I nodded, handing him a knife. It was just cooking, nothing more. For the next few minutes we worked side by side, chopping, slicing, the rhythmic sound of metal against wood filling the silence between us. It was almost comfortable. Almost normal. But then there were the small things. The way his arm would brush against mine when he reached for something. The way he leaned in slightly, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, something fresh and subtle that lingered in the air between us. The way his voice softened when he asked me questions like he was testing something unspoken. I was hyper-aware of every detail, and it was maddening. At one point I reached for a towel just as he did, our fingers colliding. It was an innocent touch, but my breath caught nonetheless. I pulled back too quickly, my face warming as I turned away. "Sorry," I murmured. "Are you?" His voice was quiet, unreadable. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself that I was overthinking things. That I was reading into something that wasn't there. But later, when I was in my bedroom changing into more comfortable clothes, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My fingers lingered on the buttons of my blouse, and I hesitated, studying the way the fabric draped over my skin. I reached for something different. Something softer, something that fit just a little better. It was a small, meaningless choice. At least that's what I told myself. When I stepped out of the room, he was walking down the hall, heading toward the stairs. He glanced at me, and for the first time I saw it. The flicker of something. It was brief, almost imperceptible. But it was enough. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, his familiar presence steady and warm. I listened to the soft rhythm of his breathing, the way he turned slightly in his sleep. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself into slumber. But my mind wouldn't quiet. Because for the first time in a long time I felt awake. The next morning felt different. The air was charged with something I couldn't name, a slow-burning tension that clung to the walls of the house. I told myself that I was imagining it, that I had created something out of nothing. But as soon as I saw him lounging in the kitchen, coffee in hand, I knew I wasn't alone in this feeling. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something new. Something deliberate. I ignored it, brushing past him to the counter, pouring myself coffee with steady hands. I could feel his presence without looking. Every small movement, every breath. It was unnerving, but not in a way that made me want to escape. Quite the opposite. The day unfolded slowly, each hour stretching longer than it should. My husband had left early again, which meant the house belonged to just the two of us. I busied myself with errands, anything to keep my thoughts from spiraling. I went out for groceries, took my time at the market, lingered longer than necessary at the checkout. When I returned, the house was quiet. I let out a slow breath, relieved and disappointed at the same time. But as I stepped into the kitchen, I found him leaning against the counter, sipping a glass of water. "Missed you," he said casually. I froze, my heart stuttering in my chest. His tone was light, playful even, but there was weight beneath it. I forced a small smile. I was gone for less than an hour. Felt longer. I swallowed hard, turning my attention to the bags in my hands. Unpacking groceries had never seemed like such an urgent task. I felt him move closer, the air shifting around me, but I didn't turn. I couldn't. We fell into a strange routine after that. Subtle, unspoken, but undeniably present. He found excuses to linger in the same rooms as me. I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. Our conversations were nothing out of the ordinary, yet each one felt like something more. Then came the drive. I had forgotten about the errand my husband had asked me to run, a simple trip to pick up a package in a nearby town. I was about to head out when he appeared at the door, keys dangling in his hand. Need company? I hesitated. It was a simple question. There was no reason to refuse. But we both knew this was something else. I nodded. Sure. The car ride started off easy, filled with neutral topics. Music, travel, vague stories about people we both knew. But the air between us was thick, humming with something unspoken. At a stoplight, I felt his gaze on me. I kept my eyes on the road. You always this quiet? I exhaled slowly. Sometimes. Not with him, though. My hands tightened on the wheel. With who? Your husband. I turned my head slightly, meeting his eyes. There was no malice there, no judgment. Just curiosity. I looked away. He and I, we have our own rhythm. He hummed as if considering my words. Is it enough? The light turned green before I had to answer. The parking lot was nearly empty when we arrived, the sun casting long shadows across the pavement. I stepped out of the car, inhaling deeply, trying to steady myself. The errand was quick. A few signatures, a polite thank you, and I was back outside. He was leaning against the car, arms crossed, watching me. I slowed as I approached, something tightening in my chest. That was fast, he said. I nodded. Silence stretched between us, thick and weighted. I should have walked past him, should have opened the car door and ended this moment before it became something I couldn't control. But I didn't. And neither did he. I wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. Maybe it didn't matter. 1 second we were standing apart. The next, his hand brushed my arm, fingertips grazing my skin like a silent question. And I answered. The kiss wasn't planned. It wasn't gentle. It was heat and hesitation, restraint and surrender all at once. Then reality crashed down. I pulled away sharply, breath unsteady, heart pounding against my ribs. His eyes searched mine, but I couldn't meet them. I turned, yanking the car door open, sinking into the seat before I could second-guess myself. The drive home was silent. But the damage was already done. The silence between us stretched far beyond the car ride home. It followed me into the house, into the space between breaths, between thoughts. My hands shook slightly as I placed my keys on the counter, but I refused to acknowledge it. If I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it hadn't happened. But it had. I could still feel the ghost of his lips on mine, the imprint of his touch on my skin. My body was betraying me, my pulse thrumming too fast whenever I let my mind drift back to the way he had looked at me afterward. As if he was waiting for me to say something, to do something. I had done nothing. I avoided him for the rest of the day. I kept to the bedroom, finding excuses to be anywhere but near him. But avoidance only lasted so long. By the time the evening settled in, my husband was home. His voice filled the house, steady and familiar. He kissed me on the cheek as he always did, his hands warm, his presence grounding. I leaned into him, trying to absorb something from the normalcy of it. It didn't work. I told myself to push through, to pretend. And for a little while I did. I smiled when I was supposed to, laughed at his stories, played the role I had perfected over the years. But beneath the surface, something inside me was unraveling. Later that night, when my husband reached for me in bed, his hands moving across my skin in a way that had once felt like home, I realized with a sharp pang that I felt nothing. No fire. No urgency. Just the weight of familiarity. I turned my head slightly, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to respond. His lips brushed against my shoulder. You okay? I nodded. Just tired. Pause. Then he sighed, pulling back, settling onto his side. You've seemed distant lately. I forced a soft laugh. I've just had a lot on my mind. He didn't press. He never did. As he drifted into sleep beside me, his breath evening out, I stared into the darkness, the quiet pressing in on me from all sides. I should have felt guilty. Instead I felt hollow. Sleep refused to come, my body restless beneath the covers. Every time I closed my eyes I saw him. The look in his eyes when I pulled away. The way his fingers had hesitated as if waiting to see if I would come back. I didn't. But I wanted to. I hated myself for it. The next morning I made a decision. I would put an end to this. Whatever this was. I walked into the kitchen preparing myself for the conversation I needed to have, for the line I needed to draw. But then I saw him. And everything I had planned to say slipped from my mind. He was sitting at the table back to me, his posture relaxed in a way that made my stomach tighten. When I stepped into the room, he turned his head slightly, meeting my gaze with something unreadable in his expression. I hesitated, fingers tightening around the counter. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. I forced myself to look away to focus on anything else. The coffee maker. The sunlight filtering through the curtains. The sound of a bird outside. Anything but him. I poured myself a cup, the silence stretching between us. Then just when I thought he might let it go, he spoke. "You're avoiding me." My fingers tightened around the mug. "I don't know what you're talking about." He exhaled a quiet laugh. "Right." I turned, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "We need to stop this. Whatever it is." His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't look away. "Is that what you want?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. Because I didn't know what I wanted. And that terrified me. He studied me for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table. "Lying doesn't suit you." I swallowed hard. "This isn't a game." A small knowing smile. "Isn't it?" I turned sharply, walking away before I did something I couldn't take back. But as I left the room, I felt his gaze linger on me, heavy and knowing. And deep down, beneath all the denial, all the guilt, I knew this wasn't over. I told myself I would stay away. That if I just ignored it, if I buried it beneath routine and responsibility, it would eventually fade into nothing. But denial is a fragile thing, easily broken by a single glance, a stray word, the wrong moment catching you off guard. It started with small things. The way my body betrayed me, reacting before my mind had a chance to intervene. A shiver when he walked past, a pulse that jumped when his voice filled the room. The worst part was that he knew. He saw every flicker of hesitation, every moment where I tried to pull away but didn't. I made excuses to be in different rooms to keep space between us, but it didn't matter. He had become a presence in my mind, impossible to shake. I would find myself lost in thought, staring at nothing, replaying moments that I shouldn't have let happen. The memory of his hand grazing mine, the warmth of his breath against my skin before I had pulled away. At night, my body lay next to my husband's, still and quiet, while my mind drifted elsewhere. It terrified me how much space he had taken up in my thoughts. How something so forbidden could feel so inevitable. Then came the moment that unraveled everything. It was late afternoon when I found myself alone in the house with him again. My husband had left for a meeting and I had planned to stay in my room, keep my distance. But I heard the sound of footsteps, of a door opening and closing, and without thinking I stepped out into the hallway. I wasn't sure what I had expected to find. Maybe I had convinced myself that if I saw him and nothing happened, I would finally be able to let this go. But when our eyes met, I knew I had been lying to myself. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching me in that quiet, unreadable way of his. He didn't say anything at first, didn't move. But the air between us felt different, heavier somehow. I should have walked away. Instead, I took a breath, steadying myself. "We can't keep doing this." A flicker of something in his expression. "Doing what?" I exhaled, trying to keep my voice even. "This." The looks, the tension. "It has to stop." He pushed off the wall, closing the space between us in a slow, deliberate step. "Why?" I swallowed hard. "Because it's wrong." His gaze flickered over my face, lingering on my lips before meeting my eyes again. "And yet you're still here." The way he said it, calm, certain, made something tighten inside me. I hated how well he could see through me, how easily he could pull apart every excuse I tried to convince myself of. I opened my mouth, ready to argue, to say something that would put a stop to this once and for all. But then he reached out, his fingers grazing my wrist, the touch barely there but enough to send a sharp jolt through my skin. I froze. The world seemed to slow, the air thick with something unspoken. I felt his fingertips linger, waiting, and I knew this was the moment. The point where I could still turn back, where I could step away and pretend this had never happened. But I didn't move. Neither did he. We stood there, caught in the kind of silence that felt deafening, the kind that carried 1,000 words neither of us dared to say. Then finally he broke it. "You want to stop this?" His voice was low, careful. "Then walk away." It was a challenge. A dare. I should have taken it. But I just stood there. And in that moment we both knew the truth. I wasn't going to walk away. I should have walked away. The logical part of me, the one that had spent years building a life of stability and order, begged me to turn around, to step back into the version of myself that wouldn't have entertained this. But I wasn't that person anymore. Maybe I hadn't been for a long time. I had crossed a line the moment I let his touch linger, the moment I stopped pretending I didn't feel the weight of his gaze on me. And now, standing there in the hallway, heart pounding against my ribs, I realized there was no going back. The silence stretched between us, thick, charged with something undeniable. My breath was shallow, my hands clenched at my sides as if holding myself together. Then he moved. It was slow, deliberate, as if waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. His hand brushed against my arm first, then trailed down, his fingers barely skimming my wrist before stopping. The touch was light, but it set my skin on fire. I should have said something, should have pulled away. But instead I just stood there, my pulse hammering in my ears. His voice was quiet, careful. Still want to pretend this isn't happening? I swallowed hard. I don't know what you mean. A soft, knowing laugh. He stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. Lying doesn't suit you. The breath hitched in my throat. I forced myself to look at him, to meet his gaze without wavering. His eyes flickered down, lingering on my lips for a second too long. And then it happened. The second kiss wasn't like the first. It wasn't a mistake born out of impulse, out of a fleeting moment of weakness. This time it was intentional. His hands found my waist, pulling me in with a certainty that left no room for hesitation. My fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt before I even realized what I was doing. The kiss was slow, almost careful, but beneath it was something desperate, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. I felt my back press against the wall, his body close enough that every inch of me was aware of him. My breath came in uneven gasps when we finally broke apart, his forehead resting against mine. Reality slammed into me all at once. I took a shaky step back, my hands still trembling as they fell away from him. "This is wrong," I whispered. He exhaled, studying me. "You don't sound convinced." I wasn't. But I couldn't say that. Instead I turned and walked away. I didn't stop until I was in my room, the door shut behind me, my back pressed against the wood. My hands were still shaking. Not with regret, but with the terrifying realization that I wanted more. I didn't leave my room for hours. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the closed door, as if it held the answer to the mess I had created. My thoughts were a tangled, incoherent blur, looping through the same questions, the same denials, the same truths I wasn't ready to admit. This wasn't just about desire. If it were, I could have buried it, forced myself to forget. But it was something deeper, something that had crept into the quiet corners of my mind long before I was willing to acknowledge it. I had spent so long convincing myself that my life was enough. That the security of my marriage, the predictability of my days, was what I needed. But now, faced with the undeniable proof that something inside me was still capable of wanting, of aching for something beyond comfort, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. By the time I finally left my room, the house was quiet. I listened for sounds, footsteps, movement, anything, but there was only stillness. I moved through the hallway cautiously, half expecting him to be waiting for me, to pick up where we had left off. But he wasn't. The living room was empty. The kitchen. The only sign that he had been there at all was a glass of water left abandoned on the counter, a faint imprint of condensation marking the wood. I let out a slow breath, relief and disappointment warring within me. It would be easier this way. If I didn't see him, if I didn't have to face the truth in his eyes, maybe I could pretend that this had never happened. Maybe I could still fix this. But then the front door opened. I turned too quickly, heart lurching in my chest as I met his gaze. He paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid. Then finally he stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. He moved with the same quiet confidence he always carried, but there was something else now, something heavier in the way he looked at me. I should have left the room. Should have turned and walked away before the moment had a chance to unravel any further. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen, as he crossed the space between us. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "You don't have to keep running." I clenched my fists at my sides. "I'm not running." A flicker of something, amusement maybe. "No." I exhaled sharply, looking away. "This has to stop." His head tilted slightly. Then why are you still standing here? I had no answer for that. The distance between us was nothing now. A single step, a breath, and he could close it. I could feel it, the weight of what would happen if I let myself give in. And I wanted to. God, I wanted to. My body swayed slightly, instinctively drawn to him before I caught myself. His eyes darkened at the movement. He saw it. He knew. You're lying to yourself, he said. The truth of it was unbearable. I took a step back. This isn't real. Something flickered across his face, something sharp, unreadable. Then why does it feel like it is? I had no answer for that either. I turned and left the room before I could say something I wouldn't be able to take back. But the truth was already there, clawing its way into my thoughts, impossible to ignore. This wasn't over. Not even close. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my body rigid beneath the covers. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The way he had looked at me. The way his voice had curled around the truth I was too afraid to face. I was lying to myself. I had been lying from the moment I let that first glance linger, from the moment I chose not to step away when he came too close. I had spent days convincing myself that this was something fleeting, something that could be controlled. But control had never been mine to begin with. When the sun finally rose, I felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. My husband stirred beside me, exhaling a quiet sigh before shifting closer. His hand brushed against mine in his sleep, a touch that should have been comforting. But instead it sent a sharp pang through me, guilt, regret, something else I wasn't ready to name. I slid out of bed carefully, my movements slow, deliberate. I needed space, air. Something to clear my head before it was too late. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, the house was still. The silence stretched thick around me, pressing against my skin like a tangible thing. And then I heard him. The faint sound of footsteps. The quiet rustle of movement from the other room. I froze. For a moment I considered turning around, going back upstairs, pretending I hadn't heard anything at all. But before I could decide, he stepped into view. He stopped when he saw me, his expression unreadable. The room felt smaller, the air charged with something unspoken. I didn't move. Neither did he. Seconds passed, stretching between us like a fragile thread pulled too tight. Then finally he exhaled. You're avoiding me. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. I'm not. He arched a brow. No. I swallowed hard. I just think we need to. Stop, he interrupted, his voice low, quiet. I flinched slightly at the word. Because I had been about to say it. That we needed to stop. That whatever this was couldn't continue. That it was dangerous, reckless, wrong. But the way he said it, like he was testing the weight of it, like he was daring me to finish the sentence, made my breath catch. He took a step closer. I didn't back away. I should have. His voice softened. You don't want to stop. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. You don't know what I want. His lips curled slightly. Don't I? The heat of him was close now, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. My pulse pounded in my ears, my body tensed with the effort of keeping myself still. Tell me to walk away, he said. I opened my mouth. No words came. His gaze searched mine, something heavy, unreadable flickering in his expression. That's what I thought. I clenched my jaw. This isn't a game. He tilted his head slightly. Then why does it feel like we're both losing? My breath hitched. Because he was right. There was no winning in this. No way to come out of this untouched and scathed. But none of that mattered. Because in that moment, as he stood there waiting for me to push him away, to end whatever this had become, I knew the truth. I wasn't going to. And neither was he. The weight of my choice settled deep in my chest. A choice I hadn't spoken aloud, hadn't fully acknowledged, but had already made the moment I stopped resisting. I had spent days pretending that I could control this, that if I just ignored it long enough it would disappear. But it hadn't. It had only grown, taking root in every quiet moment, in every glance, in every breath we shared in the same space. And now, standing in that kitchen, his gaze holding mine, I knew there was no turning back. I should have told him to walk away. I should have walked away myself. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence stretch, thick with everything we couldn't say. He was waiting for me to speak, to put an end to this before it was too late. But I wasn't ready to. Because deep down I knew it was already too late. I looked away first, inhaling sharply, my grip tightening around the counter. My hands felt cold, my skin too hot. My body was at war with itself, fighting against the logic I had spent my entire life clinging to. His voice was softer when he finally spoke. You don't have to be afraid of this. I closed my eyes. You don't understand. Pause. Then make me understand. My throat tightened. It's not that simple. He exhaled slowly and I could feel his frustration, the tension humming between us like something alive. Do you love him? The question hit harder than I expected. I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Of course I do. His expression remained unreadable. Then why are you here standing in front of me instead of next to him? The air left my lungs in a sharp, uneven breath. Because I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did. Maybe I had known it all along. I had convinced myself for so long that love was enough. That loyalty, routine, and the life we had built together would always outweigh fleeting temptation. That the ache in my chest, the longing for something more, was just a phase, something that would pass. But it hadn't. And standing here now, the truth crashed over me with terrifying clarity. I wanted this. Not just the tension, the secrecy, the thrill of something forbidden. I wanted him. I had been telling myself that I was losing control, but the truth was, I had never had it to begin with. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. I flinched, my pulse hammering in my ears as reality slammed back into place. My husband. I stepped back too quickly, my breath coming in uneven gasps. He watched me, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. Neither of us moved. Then, without a word, I turned and left the room. By the time I reached the door, my heart was still racing, my body still humming with the remnants of something unfinished. I plastered a smile on my face, steadying myself before opening it. And when I saw my husband standing there, his eyes warm and familiar, I felt something inside me splinter. Because no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't pretend anymore. I had already crossed the line. And there was no coming back from it.